Welcome to Payne on Politics, a podcast where host Dr. Gregory Payne of Emerson College sits down with fellow experts to discuss the current state of politics, public opinion, and global affairs. In a world growing increasingly complex, communication and critical thinking is key. This only makes the Emerson motto, expression necessary to evolution, more true.
Hello, I'm Gregory Payne, the Chair of Communication Studies, also co-director of the Emerson Blanquerna Global Center. And I'm here with Oliver Rick, who's going to talk to us about his new book, Global Sports and Contemporary China. Welcome, Oliver.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
It's great. Before we went on, we were talking a little bit about the special aspect of the Olympics being a branding of nations, and
Sure.
that seems to be a major theme of what you're looking at when you look at China. Could you tell us a little bit about the thrust of the book, as well as your view of how sports bridges cultures as well as establishes brands?
Yeah, definitely. It's the project came about by being interested in the period between the 2008 Olympics in Beijing and then the 2012 Olympics in Beijing. 2022 Olympics in Beijing. When Beijing hosted both of those, it became the first city ever to host the summer and the winter games. And there was a period between where a lot changed, a lot happened, and the way in which the government in China sought to get something out of 2008 and out of 2022 was very different. Obviously, a lot changed around them, but their intent was different between the two for sure. 2008 was obviously a massively significant event for China, for Beijing. Many kind of refer to it as a coming out for the country. And I do think that it provided an important platform to signal China's growth, a decade of almost double-digit GDP growth for the country and its new role in a global system. 2022 was much more intended to be a normalization of the place of China at the center of world sport and of the global system more broadly. With COVID, that changed, and that certainly brought a new element to it. But I think that shift in what it could do for the country was significant and of interest for us, and what happened in between. That was an important period. Xi Jinping comes to power in 2013 and has fundamentally changed the politics of China in the last 10 years. So a lot happened in that period that the book focuses on.
Right. Now, you mentioned one thing that I find so exciting is you said this was a strategic formation of a sports system meant to carry out particular goals. Sometimes when we talk about the Olympics, we say, well, this is politically free, and yet I know, having seen China come in 1984 to Los Angeles, but of course the Russians didn't come because we had boycotted in 82 because of the Afghanistan invasion. How do you see the political spectacle and sports spectacle merging, and how important is this to China? You said the coming out party. Sure. What has President Xi done to either enhance it or maybe to de-emphasize it?
Yeah. I mean, for sure, the Olympics, is a political spectacle. That is first and foremost. And the thing that reinforces that is, for a long time, there's been this idea that the Olympics has some economic potential built into it. Realistically, in the last 20 years, most of the Olympic events have not made money. They've been massive debt generators. To the greatest extent, we could look at Sochi in 2014. It cost $51 billion for a Winter Olympics, made maybe $3-4 billion in generated revenue. Right. It quite clearly was not about money. So it's political, and China was well aware of that. And in 2008, it was a period of significant growth. It wasn't the first Olympics that they bid for. They did bid for 2000 and didn't get it. And I think that only further intensified the want to get the games and to use it as a platform. Certainly a kind of concern about Western bias that they didn't get it in 2000, and it ends up going to Sydney. But for 2008, when they do get it, there's no holds barred. Right? For them, it's everything. It's 8 to 10 years of full-on investment in terms of the sporting system. The whole sporting system is restructured around national performance at the Olympics. The idea was to host the first home Olympics and to win, by every measure they could possibly think of, to absolutely win that event. And up until Sochi, it was the most expensive Olympics in history. It's still the most expensive summer games. And yeah, it was a big spectacle. I think for those of us that were not too young at that point can remember the 2,000 drummers at the opening ceremony. It was a huge thing. For 2022, for Xi, I think when he comes into power, he comes in off the back of that games and rides that wave a little bit. But for him, there is different challenges and different things that he needs to take on at the beginning of his time. One of the things that comes through massive growth is a lot of people, and China's a huge population, so this is not to say everyone, but a significant population got lifted out of poverty, out of working class, into middle class lives, and trying to manage this new big, increasingly wealthy, increasingly urban, increasingly globally aware, increasingly educated middle class was a challenge. Using sport to service the interests of that group was a big part of what he did initially. Getting the Winter Games kind of built into that, again, that kind of normalization of China at the center of the global sports system, and how that signaled it as a center of the global system more broadly as a superpower, I think was important. That really was the initial, I think, push to get the 2022 games. Much in the, again, I don't mean to reference Russia overly, although it's on my mind a lot right now, but Russia did the same thing with the FIFA World Cup in 2018. Mm-hmm. The Sochi Games was this big, elaborate spectacle. 2018 was about normalization, and to some degree that's what 2022 does with Beijing, or at least intent. COVID changes a lot with that. He is already wary of the middle class and their power, and there's some change in direction, and I do think that curtails some of the influence of 2022, but we are still pretty close to the kind of impact of that, and it'll be interesting to see over certainly the next 5 years, to see kind of what that's used for, what that has signaled in terms of some of the changes, and I do think that now we have seen an end to COVID zero policy in China. There could be some interesting directions that we go from here, for sure.
Now you present, Oliver, you present this dilemma. On one hand, you're coming out for China.
Sure.
And on the other hand, you're encouraging development, but you've got this middle class, which of
Sure.
course is going to have more critical thinking skills, maybe ask a lot of questions. Do you think that people in China, on one hand, they want China to be a world power, but what do they think about the idea that they're going to have more people probably asking questions, which I think many of us ask, and that is, how can a communist country continue to go the route that it is?
Sure. Yeah. No. It is. I think one of the fundamental challenges that faces China right now, and has for a little while. Xi Jinping, he is kind of one of the princes of China. Like he grew up in the shadow of the Communist Party and its early establishment in the 60s, 70s. Not long after Mao comes to power, he grows up in that system. He is a son of Maoist thought. Like, that is his legacy, and so he is conservative in those ways, and he lived through watching the fall of the Soviet system. Right. Perestroika and the opening up of the Soviet system, he saw what that brought, which was the end of the Soviet system, and there's always that fear. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge of how do you create development, create advancement for your people, but do so in a way that still allows the power to the party to maintain its power and its place within the country. Mm-hmm. That is one that I think he is still struggling with. I don't know if he has really worked out the best mm-hmm. the best way to approach that, because as much as you're going to struggle on the one hand with not providing people that path for advancement and giving people those opportunities to engage in that global system and so on, I think that could cause you trouble if you try to suppress that too hard. Mm-hmm. But if you open it up too much, as you said, that does bring in potential for pushback.
Right.
And so there has been trying to work that out, and it's variously failed and succeeded in different ways. But the regulation of media and the internet, whilst also seeing kind of economic expansion, like you can see how those two things are trying to get both sides of that same problem, right? So I think that is really his biggest issue. I think that he looks to, I mean, famously at the last party conference meeting, he shunned one of the last premiers of China and leaders of the party. The previous two people that were in charge in China were seen as weak in terms of that control of the cultural kind of influence coming from outside, particularly from the West.
Right.
He certainly does not celebrate that. He's wary of that history. So he is more hardline. He is more conservative in that way. But yeah, he's overseen that moment where the fruition of that growth came to, and all of a sudden he was in charge of a new middle class, potentially the biggest middle class in the world.
Yes.
So yeah, he's in an interesting place for sure.
Quite a challenge.
Yeah.
I know for many of us, and of course, the title of this podcast is Pain on Politics.
Sure.
And we oftentimes talk a lot about sports. To me, it's very difficult to separate the two, and I think you can see them intertwined. Having been to Beijing, of course, and China, I'm impressed by the rapid growth, the infrastructure, all of that. And I was going to ask you, I know that when I visited Africa, there's this whole concept of stadium diplomacy that China is exporting. What are your thoughts on their attempt, to, I would say, through soft power, of course, expand the influence?
Yeah, definitely. I think there can be a misnomer or a misunderstanding of the Chinese system from the West, that somehow China is trying to replicate the Western approach to imperialism or influence. It's not. I think for China, the place that it will always come back to is this belief in one China, and securing that existence. I think where we have seen expansion and influence, a lot of that has been about securing that home space for China, right? So as big as China is, and 1.3 billion people at this point, they recognize that takes a lot of resources to build an economy like that. It takes a lot of things that they just don't have necessarily straight at hand. So when we look at things like the Belt and Road Initiative, and then that reaching over into those investments in Africa, for China, there is recognition. They're trying to build a green economy of sorts, right? And they know they want to be able to do that somewhat independently. They want to do that not relying on silicon chips from Taiwan or from the US, right? They're trying to do those things independently. Well, if you want to build an EV fleet, or you want to make computers or phones or whatever, you need things like cobalt. Well, cobalt mining happens in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Right.
Like, 14 of the world's biggest cobalt mines are in the Congo. China now owns about 11 of them. Right, so they've just been very thoughtful and strategic in terms of those outward investments. Again, it's not because I think China wants to set up a colony in Africa. That's not what it is, right? But as you said, through those different forms of diplomacy, often utilizing more nuanced, soft approaches, building stadia, building infrastructure in countries in Africa and elsewhere, and along the Belt and Road route through Central Asia. They've been able to secure access to resources. It's not that they want to set up a colony. They don't want to occupy Togo as a Chinese colony, but they do want to be able to secure those relationships and those resources that they need to build their economy and secure that one China. That's, I think, the vision. Yeah.
Okay, I guess a question about it. When you've described this, the story you've told, it's a bit different than you see and you hear when you turn on any of the American media, which is this impending, I would say, collision between the U.S. and China. From your study, and you of course have a co-author, what are your views? Do you think that we can peacefully coexist, that we can find more that unites us than divides us, or do you think that we're going to have this sort of destiny of conflict and potential war?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, I think that, like, certainly when we look at the land borders of China, I think this idea of Chinese expansionism is pretty limited. Again, obviously, we can be incredibly critical of the expansion into Tibet and even Western kind of expansion into Xinjiang and what they've done there, right? So like, obviously critical of what that looks like, but I don't think China is necessarily looking to expand much beyond that, right? Like there is reason at least, and I don't necessarily agree with that, right? But there's reason as to why they saw Tibet as part of that one China. They saw these, as these traditional borders of this space, which is why they've been so interested in recouping Hong Kong, right? It's about reunifying that one China, and why they're so interested in reunifying Taiwan into that.
Now, what are your thoughts, Oliver, on Taiwan? What do you think we're going there?
I think it again, for me, Taiwan has essentially functioned as an independent nation, and should continue to do so. I'm always going to push for, a truly and deeply form of democracy as best as possible as anywhere I can see it. At the same time, I also recognize the challenge and the impetus that certainly the Chinese Communist Party faces, right? They have a civil war. The people they're fighting against run an exile to Taiwan. At what point are they ever going to say to themselves, like, yeah, you're fine, you can just have your own space off our coast, right? Like, I can see the historical legacy of that moment to never really want to resolve it with Taiwan independence. So I can always see that that's going to be incredibly difficult to overcome. I don't know if it will ever overcome, but I think for me, we can and should do what we can to protect Taiwan as an independent state as effectively functioned. But yeah, I do at the same time. I think it can be overlooked as to what the drive is there for the party in the People's Republic. I think there is often an ignorance as to what that drive is to keep hold of Taiwan as best as possible.
Right.
I think for me, I'm English, but living in America these days, like, I think the best way I can ever say it to people that I speak to is like, you have a civil war, right? I mean, you had a civil war here. If instead of defeating, the other side, they just were like, oh, we're gonna just take Florida. Fine, we'll just take Florida and we'll just stay here. At what point would the U.S. federal government be like, yeah, you're good, just keep it, right? Like, there would always be a historical impetus to reclaim it, right? And to unify. That's the drive. So I don't know if that'll ever be overcome. I don't know. I can't, I'm not saying I agree with that, but I do understand where that drive is coming from.
Right.
I think in terms of Chinese and U.S. relations, I think that we are walking a pointless path, and I'm often disappointed as to how universal this viewpoint is of China as the big bad boogeyman of the world. Obviously, like, there are challenges, there are issues in terms of those relations that exist. Do I think that China has particular issues that need to be addressed? Yeah. Do I think that China is a uniquely bad state? No, right? Like, we've all got our challenges, and I think that sometimes we can be blind to our own issues. And China can be a useful get out of jail free card, in the sense that you just say, oh, well, if I want to get a policy through or I want a talking point, I just say, well, it's to defeat China, right? And that's simple and it's easy, and it's a political win here, but I don't know if that really does much.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, China poses some interesting challenges, but yeah, economically, environmentally, politically, like, there are other issues as well. I think that it's overly simplistic to see China as the only issue, or even necessarily the biggest issue we face. I think that as a country, we consistently overlook something like India because it's generally been supportive of U.S. policies and ideas, but India is a increasingly rightward leaning, increasingly authoritarian state, right, under Mahindra Modi.
Yes.
So am I wary of that too? Yeah, equally wary of those things for sure.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
but I think China's become an easy shorthand, an easy
Yes,
easy
yes.
thing to do.
An easy double figure at this particular
definitely.
time in our rhetoric.
Yeah, definitely.
Wanted to ask you, I know you've got a meeting coming up here shortly
Sure.
with students, but wanted to ask you, Oliver, how did you get to where you are? You say that you're English. Right
Yep.
now you've indicated you don't live too far away in Boston. I've already
Sure.
said come back and potentially do some guest lectures.
Yeah, definitely.
Give us a little bit about Oliver's life.
Yeah, so I did my undergrad in England. I did a double major, one in sports and coaching, and then the other one in economics.
Yes.
And I know this is, now in retrospect crazy to say, but I thought I enjoy sports. I'll do the sport for fun, and I'll do the economics for when I need a job. And I've never worked in economics a day in my life, but nonetheless, I enjoyed both. And then in the last year, I got to study abroad in the US, which now I live here again, feels very odd to say. But I studied at University of Rhode Island for a semester, and did well and enjoyed it, and got offered to come back and do my master's degree at University of Rhode Island with Dr. Kyle Coos. And he opened my eyes and introduced me to a sociological, cultural perspective on sport, and I really took it from there. And with him, my master's work was largely around international athletes in the NCAA system, and then he suggested that I went on to University of Maryland for my PhD, which I did, and worked with Dr. David Andrews down at University of Maryland. And that program, the program's called Physical Cultural Studies, and that program was just like absolutely just like blew me away in a lot of ways. I don't know, it's one of those things, you finish your master's degree and you say, can a PhD be that much different than a master's degree? And so I thought I'll be fine. And I remember going to Maryland and taking my first class and probably spending the first 8 weeks just being like, I don't understand a word they've said. Like 2 months and I don't get it. And finally it started to click, and things made sense, and it was just a great program. I learned a lot and made some great friends and colleagues, and great mentorship from Dr. Andrews. And then from there I went on, did a little bit of adjunct teaching as it was, and kind of worked my way into a tenure track position at Springfield College, which is where I am now, as an associate professor. And it was while I was at Springfield College teaching that I had a grad student who's from China, Jack Li, who co-authored the book. He brought the idea to me that we do some research around tennis in China. This was in 2017, and it was growing. It was big. They were having more tour events in China than in North America at the time. And he was a tennis umpire in the summers, and he said, "Hey, there's something going on here. Like, why tennis in China? What's going on?" And I said, "No, I don't know. Let's have a look at it." Luckily, we have a partner university, Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou, and they were willing to host us to come over and spend some time doing that research and collecting that data, where we got to interview a whole wide array of people in the tennis system in China. And when we were there, we were like, this is definitely an interesting thing that's happening with tennis here, but it's not just tennis. It's people picking up these kind of Western sports, and they're growing and becoming big, and they're not traditionally part of Chinese culture and system. Basketball's been there for a long time, soccer's been there for a long time, but tennis, ultra marathon running, triathlon, cycling, all these new Western sports that were new for a Chinese context, and we're like, this is interesting. There's these relatively, well-off middle to upper middle class people playing Western sports, new to a Chinese context. What's happening here? And that was the spark to what got us to the book. Yeah.
Terrific. Well, I think one thing we all think about is having been at Illinois, you walk into that PhD program and you're going, what did I get myself into? But
100%.
you connect the dots.
Yeah.
I also love the idea that you connected with your graduate student. And
Yeah.
you got that type of dialectical encounter.
Oh yeah, no, it was just an amazing opportunity, and he's gone on and graduated. So he's Dr. Jack Li now, and is at University of Washington, and has gone on to be a great colleague, and we continue to work in this area. And obviously he couldn't be here, but he facilitated so much of what we were able to do with the book that it just wouldn't have happened.
Right.
He brought the idea to me in the first place, but for that initial project, but yeah, he just made everything click for us in terms of that. So yeah, it was something that doesn't always happen with students, but when it does, it's like so exciting, and I think students think it's exciting from their side, but it's exciting from our side too. Sure. Sure. It was something that I was like, wow, like this is awesome. So unique opportunity, and
yes,
I'm glad we grabbed it.
Well, what I would say, I could go on.
Yeah.
Oliver, you have to guarantee me that you'll come back.
For sure.
But we are going to have students, I think, in about 3 minutes.
Okay.
They say, Dr. Payne, you should have kept him. Thank you so much. And we'd like to also ask your co-author to come. I know he's out in Washington. Definitely. So anytime.
Yeah.
Just realize at Emerson, we've got a very dynamic sports program, graduate and undergraduate. And we would love to have you come back and tell us more about the important global aspect of sports.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thanks again. Payne on Politics here at Emerson College with Oliver Rick, an author. You need to get this book. It's called Global Sports in Contemporary China, Sports Policy and International Relations. Take care.